Ji Kang was just 40 at the time of his execution. After his death, what became of his 6 celebrated companions? In their lifetime, they courted controversy. But how would later generations remember this group of 3rd century scholars, famously known as the 7 Sages of the Bamboo Grove?
It was in the 8th lunar month of the year 262 that Ji Kang met his end. But what became of his companions from the bamboo grove after his death? Xiang Xiu shut himself in his home and entered into a period of deep reflection. After several days, he travelled to Luoyang, where he visited the residence of the de facto ruler Sima Zhao. There, he found Sima in conference with his councillors. According to the history of the Jin dynasty, on seeing Xiang Xiu, Sima Zhao feigned surprise. He asked, "I hear you aspire to a life in the Qishan mountains, so what brings you here?" Legend has it that in prehistoric times the great Yao intended to pass the throne to Chao Fu and Shu You, but reluctant to accept such responsibility, they fled to the Qishan mountains. Sima Zhao was referring to this episode. Xiang Xiu replied, "Chao Fu and Shu You were upright men. They simply didn't understand that Lord Yao meant well. Anyway, we can't admire what they did." Sima Zhao was pleased by this reply. Subsequently, Xiang Xiu became an official at court. From gentleman cavalier attendant, he progressed to gentleman attendant at the palace gate, cavalier attendant in ordinary, and other posts. But he paid scant attention to his duties. The fact was, he decided he had no alternative other than to accept such official positions, if he was to avoid Ji Kang's fate. In the year 272, just 10 years after Ji Kang's death, Xiang Xiu passed away at the age of 45. He is said to have died a sad man. His tomb, located near his home, can still be seen almost 2,000 years later. After Ji Kang's death, Ruanji turned to liquor. Scarcely a day passed without him drinking himself to oblivion. In the 10th lunar month of the year 263, Cao Huan, who had become nominal emperor following the death of Cao Mao, was forced to grant the title Duke Jingong to Sima Zhao. Ruanji knew that this promotion heralded an imminent change of regime. An official by the name of Zhang Chung proposed that Ruanji compose a eulogy to mark Sima Zhao's elevation in rank.
那么劝进表当然急着要用，但是过了好几天了，仍然不见动静，这个心急火燎的郑冲就赶紧派人去找阮籍，可是到了阮籍家里面，发现阮籍却不在家里面。
They eventually found Ruanji drunk at Yuan Xiaoni's home. He had apparently forgotten about the eulogy. The visitors woke him and explained that they needed it right away. The fact was, Ruanji had no desire to write it. He had turned to drink as a way of avoiding the task. But now, it was clear that there was no getting out of it. So, despite being drunk, Ruanji bent over his desk and dashed off a eulogy for an elevation in rank. Historical records state that the eulogy was a masterpiece of beautiful writing. Sima Zhao was delighted by the eulogy. One cold night, a month or two after these events, Ruanji, despondent, depressed, and filled with self-disgust, passed away. He was 54. Just before his death, he recalled the bamboo grove where he and his friends had once gathered, and he also recalled a poem he had written. Time passes day by day, night by night. My face has changed, and my spirit is low. My heart burns in anxiety, bringing changes within myself. Nothing in the universe is never exhausted, and my wisdom is insufficient. I fear that in a moment my spirit will fly away on the wind. All my life I have walked on ice. Who knows the uneasiness in my soul? In the 8th lunar month of the year 265, 2 years after Ruanji's death, Sima Zhao died of illness. And 4 months later, Sima Zhao's son, Sima Yan, forced the Emperor Cao Huan to abdicate. In Luoyang, the ministers and generals at court offered sacrifices to heaven and held a grand ceremony at which they implored Sima Yan to accept the throne. The new emperor named his dynasty Jin and designated Luoyang as the capital. The dynasty Sima Yan founded is known in history as the Western Jin. Under Sima Yan as emperor, Shan Tao, another of the 7 sages, gained successive promotions at court. He eventually rose to become Minister of Education and achieved his childhood dream of attaining the rank of duke. Historical records describe Shan Tao as a fair and incorruptible official. Although he was in an important position, he continued to live with his family in an old house with only a dozen rooms. In the autumn of the year 283, Shan Tao fell seriously ill, and before long, he passed away. He was 79. He was buried in his home village. Ruanxian, another of the 7 sages, had been recommended to Sima Yan by Shan Tao.
Shan Tao 说：“阮咸，真数寡欲，生死清浊，万物不能移也。若在官人之职，必妙绝于世。”后来阮咸担任了始平太守。
Ji Kan was just 40 at the time of his execution. After his death, what became of his 6 celebrated companions? In their lifetime, they courted controversy. But how would later generations remember this group of 3rd century scholars, famously known as the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove?
Did Ruanxian continue to whistle and play his qin? Did he still drink? What were his achievements as prefect? A lack of historical records means it is impossible to answer such questions. However, the history of the Jin dynasty does tell us that he lived a long life and died a natural death. As for Liao Ling, the history of the Jin dynasty describes him as reticent, careful in making friends, and seldom prone to mistakes in handling affairs. Like Xiang Xiu, he felt obliged to accept an official position after Ji Kang's death. However, he continued to drink as heavily as ever, and he would avoid offering an opinion. Eventually, Sima Yan dismissed him. Historical records relate that after being removed from his post, Liu Ling, instead of returning to his home village in Anhui, ran a tavern near the Yellow River in Sangusi in Huojia County, Henan Province. A post road ran past Sangusi, and Liu Ling's wine had a fine reputation, so his tavern was always full of customers. Liu Ling had many children and grandchildren, so many in fact, that at one time Sangusi was called Liu Ling Village. It later became known as Liugudi. Liu Ling died around the year 300 when he was almost 80 years old. He was buried a kilometre to the northeast of Liugudi. The annals of Huojia County describe Liu Ling's tomb as measuring 22 metres from east to west, 17 metres from north to south, and 1 metre in height. According to the villagers, the grave mound disappeared just 20 years ago when the locals needed the earth for building houses. Today, the only sign of Liu Ling's tomb is a narrow ridge between wheat fields. Wang Rong, another of the seven sages, died in the year 305 at the age of 72. In one historical account, it is recorded that Ruanji's descendants and the offspring of several leading families and other idlers, including Ruanjian, Wang Chang, Xie Kun, and Hu Wufu, expounded on Ruanji's philosophy and claimed that they had a thorough understanding of the ultimate doctrine of the universe. In a deliberate act, they removed their headgear and clothing to expose their ugly nudity like beasts.
除了上述几个人之外，三简、阮修、毕周、杨曼、阮福、张邯等人，与之相比，其表现也有过之而无不及。他们中有的就是竹林七贤的后人，如三简是三韬之子，阮修是阮籍的侄子。史书上记载有不少关于他们纵情放荡的趣闻。
Historical documents record that when Shan Tao's son Shanjian was prefect of Jingzhou, he would regularly pass by a place called Gaoyang's Pool, where he would stop and drink until he was intoxicated. A contemporary poem about him went, Lord Shan heads straight to Gaoyang's Pool and gets drunk from time to time. At dusk he arrives home, his face turned back, reeling and insentient. Ruanji's nephew, Ruan Xiu, disdained uneducated people. The 5th century collection of short stories called New Account of Tales of the World describes him thus. He had 100 coins hanging from his walking stick, and when he reached a tavern, he would drink alone.
同阮修一样，身为吏部郎的毕周也十分好酒。据说一次他在偷饮邻人家储藏的酒的时候被捉住了。当主人知道他的身份以后又把他放了，而且还邀请毕周一起喝酒。毕周端起酒杯就接着痛饮，直到喝得酩酊大醉以后才离去。
The great early 20th century artist Qi Baishu seems to have been an admirer of Bi Zhuo. He created a painting based on this episode, which he inscribed with the lines, "The minister dismissed from office has not a single coin in his purse, he would rather steal a drink than be seen as a corrupt official. As for Bi Zhuo himself, he once described his life's pursuits as grabs in one hand and a wine cup in the other, and his lifelong aspiration as to swim in a pool of wine. There were those who tried to ape the seven sages, but their learning tended to be superficial. They lacked the penetrating insight of Ruanji and Ji Kang. In the 4th and early 5th centuries, metaphysical thinking waned, and the behavior of the metaphysical philosophers came under close scrutiny. They were criticized for their irrationality and self-indulgence. The 4th century philosopher and medical scientist Ge Hong commented on them, saying, "People hear that Ruanji was arrogant and self-indulgent, a man who sees through the world, as the ancients described it, sees through everything in order to attain morality and benevolence. Should one see through the world in order to attain debauchery and immorality?" The famous 20th century writer Lu Xun pointed out that because the sages had such a great reputation, ordinary people wanted to follow them. But what they learned from them was superficial. Their inner world largely remained a mystery, and the result was that people simply adopted their habits of idle gossip and heavy drinking.
Ji Kang was just 40 at the time of his execution. After his death, what became of his 6 celebrated companions? In their lifetime, they courted controversy. But how would later generations remember this group of 3rd century scholars, famously known as the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove?
By the early 5th century, scholars were reflecting on the collapse of the Western Jin dynasty, which had occurred 100 years earlier. Their conclusion was that the regime had been undermined by decadent and idle officials. In a memorial to Sima Rui, the early 4th century emperor, an official by the name of Yingjian was blunt about the reasons for the downfall of the Western Jin. Since the Yuan Kang era, he said, referring to the final decade of the 3rd century, people have been playing down doctrine and playing up metaphysical principles. They treat abstract discourse as comprehensive knowledge and treat government and thrift as something inferior. The disaster of Yongjia had its roots in such unhealthy trends. Another official, Bian Hu, was critical of young nobles for their hedonistic lifestyle. He accused them of defying propriety and doctrine, which he described as the most heinous of sins. Historically, when it comes to examining the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove, there have been 2 diametrically opposed viewpoints. Those who are against them have tended to adopt the Confucian approach. They criticize the 7 sages for advocating the Taoist nihilist philosophy that undermines the teachings of the ultimate sage. They have thus criticized them on moral grounds for subverting the principles of ethics and for undermining the country through their lack of social responsibility.
那么至于讲的这个清谈误国，这个呢，确实是一个很长时间对竹林七贤，包括当时玄学清谈的一个评定啊，就是认为他们清谈误国。那么误不误国，这个呢很难讲，因为我们说一个朝廷的覆没。一个社会秩序的最终导致混乱有多种原因，
The philosopher Gu Yanwu at the turn of the Ming and Qing dynasties was unequivocal in ascribing the downfall of the Western Jin and later the Jin dynasty to the sages of the Bamboo Grove. He wrote, "After Grand Tutor Sima Yi killed Grand General Tao Shuang, for a time all influential intellectuals abandoned the classics and turned to the philosophy of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. They regarded the safety of the monarch as that of a passerby. This attitude was advocated by the seven sages." However, Lu Xun pointed out, later people blamed Ji Kang and Ruanji. People have parroted the same opinion of them for over 1,600 years.
对于历史上的争论呢，我们很难简单的评判孰是孰非。事实上啊，无论是对竹林七贤这个群体，还是对其中的某个人物，无论是持否定态度还是肯定态度，都是有一定道理的。由于竹林七贤思想及人格的双重性和复杂性，对他们的评价呀，也就既有褒也有贬了。
Whatever the different judgments on them, the seven sages remain a symbol of a cultural phenomenon. Their unconventional attitude towards life influenced intellectuals and officials right up until the 19th century. Today, many centuries later, how should the seven sages of the Bamboo Grove and their legacy be assessed? Confucian thinkers believed in maintaining feudal rule, and to this end, they created a system of proprieties and advocated the related ideology and ethics.
历史的看呢，这些东西并非完全没有可取的内容，特别是在封建社会的初期，在地主阶级处于上升的阶段，其中的不少内容对稳定当时的社会秩序，对促进当时社会的发展，应当说起了一定作用。
However, Confucian ideology, if taken to the extreme, limits people's thinking and conduct and deprives them of their sense of self and their independent personality. During the mid-3rd and early 4th centuries, with the rise of metaphysical thinking, the philosophers represented by Ji Kang and Ruanji used Taoist philosophy as a vehicle for promoting human consciousness. It can justifiably be claimed that Ji Kang's proposition of bypassing doctrine and adopting one's own stance ushered in a self-liberation movement.
魏晋时代是赋予独立人格精神的时代，远及嵇康在这里起到了主导作用、推进作用。后世文士在反对旧礼教、假道学、追求独立人格和精神自由的过程中，他们往往能够感受到嵇康、远及竹林七贤他们对他们的鼓舞和推动作用。
Evidently, certain aspects of the Seven Sages' philosophy and behavior were objectionable. Some of them, in emphasizing their individuality, were undoubtedly guilty of neglecting the core values of human society. The noted 20th century philosopher Zhang Dainian held that the metaphysical philosophy advocated by Ruanji could never serve as a guiding ideology for government.
因此，我们认为，对以嵇康为核心的竹林七贤，他们的思想和行为，应当做历史的具体的分析和恰当的评价，不能简单的肯定或者否定。
Everything in the world is a unity of opposites, and so is every person. The seven sages are no exception. They left the world almost 2,000 years ago, but they seem still to be relevant. They've been talked about for nearly 2,000 years, and no doubt will continue to be a topic of debate far into the future.
It was a fate worse than death. Exile in Qing Dynasty times was the punishment awaiting officials found guilty of malpractice. Exile meant a life cut short by hard labor and near starvation, spent in a far-flung corner of the country. But occasionally, these exiles might make their mark on the backwater where they found themselves. Such was the case with a group of men sent in exile to Ningguta on journeys in time.